Well, that was an awesome introduction, and welcome for having me here on stage. I'm going to talk about, as the announcer already said, I'm going to talk about WebAssembly, and I'm going to talk about a framework that is actually pretty much production ready to create applications by using WebAssembly. But before we start, let's first do a quick introduction on WebAssembly. So what is WebAssembly, and why is it cool? So the thing with WebAssembly is that it is a bytecode format that contains your application code. Unlike JavaScript or other scripting languages, it's a bytecode format. And these days, that means that it is a compilation target for higher level languages. So we can actually compile something like C, or in this case, I'm going to be using C#. It's going to be compiled into WebAssembly. It can be compiled into WebAssembly. So to show you how that pretty much works, so I have a C function here. You can actually look this up at Wikipedia as well, but it's just to give you an impression in a nutshell how this works. I have a higher level language, in this case a C function, that can be compiled into WebAssembly, which is the bytecode format. So this is something, the linear assembly bytecode is something more difficult to read. It does make sense, but you can imagine that if you have a lot of code, this is getting quite difficult to work with. And this can actually be encoded. And this is obviously for the web a very cool thing, because what you see is that the binary encoding is the same as the linear one, but it's way smaller. So for downloading this stuff, it's quite efficient. And one of the other things is that this code can actually be executed in the browser straight away. So unlike JavaScript, if you have a web page that is containing JavaScript, whether it is something with a full framework, the browser needs to download this stuff, it needs to interpret all the code, and it needs to execute it. And I mean, the JavaScript engines these days are some pretty awesome technology, I do have to admit that. But with WebAssembly, the code is already compiled. It just needs to be downloaded, and off we go. So it's quicker, it's faster. One of the other really cool things, that's also why it's it's quite hot these days, it is a web standard. Maybe there are some people here who did some Flash development in the past, or maybe even Silverlight. Well, these days, yeah, it's getting more difficult to get like Flash applications to run. Well, even Silverlight it's game over because of the plugin architecture. So with Flash, you needed to install a Flash plugin. With Silverlight, same story. With WebAssembly, you don't. It runs without any plugins. So then you might think, but what about security issues? Well, it runs in the same sandbox as JavaScript application. So this means that you have the same security-related things. There are things that can't be done with JavaScript, but those things can't be done with WebAssembly as well, because there is this sandbox that will protect the local machine. So you can't access local storage, you can't access webcams, all that kind of stuff without permission from the user. So that is a security issue, measurement here. So don't worry about security. There are still boundaries that your application runs in. And one of the other cool things is that it is supported by all major browsers. I'm not talking about IE 6 or 7 or whatsoever, but everything which is recent these days, it runs in there, including mobile browsers as well. Okay, so then there is this next thing. What is Blazor? Well, there are some experimental tools, and there are some other tools as well that allow you to create WebAssembly applications, but most of them are they're quite abstract, or they're still in prototype phase, or it's quite a bit of work to actually build something in WebAssembly. Well, Blazor is something which is coming from Microsoft. The guy who invented Blazor is somebody you probably all know, Steve Sanderson. He did another framework which is called Knockout.js. This is his next baby. It's a component-based UI framework for creating spas. It is based on .NET Core Razor pages, and I'll give a really quick intro on that as well a bit later. Don't get worried, it's quite simple, and it works with Razor markup together with HTML, CSS, and all the other web assets that you need. And like a couple of JavaScript frameworks, it uses a virtual DOM, which is called a render tree, to actually do the updates on the UI. The cool thing actually with Blazor is that this rendering engine basically can be replaced with another one. And that brings a couple of very nice features, and I'll touch on one of those features just shortly, but I want you to be aware of that. And as I mentioned, it can use WebAssembly and Mono to run C# in your browser. I did put it on bold, can. It is not necessary, but obviously on this Frontend Developer Love conference, we will do some stuff with WebAssembly. But this also has to do with the previous bullet point. It uses the replaceable virtual DOM, basically. All right, so a really fast intro on Razor. Razor is a markup language, basically, which is also developed by Microsoft, and it's pretty straightforward. It's a template markup syntax based in C#. And the way that it works is, well, one of the things is that the HTML that's being produced is actually pretty much the same as the one that you use in the Razor templates. And I'll give you a really small example. I hope it's readable here a bit. So this is a typical Razor fragment of code. What you see is that the @ sign followed by the curly brace. After that, there is some Blazor instruction. This is all C# language. Looks quite a bit like JavaScript and some other languages as well, but it's a pretty straightforward language. I won't go too deep into the C# language in this session, though I will be coding some C#, but I'm pretty sure you all know what's going on when I code the C#. And then we have some HTML, and also on the right here, the @myMessage is again a Razor syntax. So that's a variable which lives in your page, and it will be replaced with the actual value. So it's quite a straightforward thing. And if you would see how this would execute, I hope it's all readable here. You'll see that this Razor will translate runtime in something like that. So again, quite simple. And I'll be doing a bit of Razor, and I'll be doing a bit of C#, but I'll explain what happens, and it all makes sense. It's actually a very easy system to get started with. All right, so we have two flavors of Blazor in right now, and I'm going to talk primarily about the second one. The first one is ServerSide Blazor. I'll touch this really quickly. What actually happens is that there is no WebAssembly involved here. Everything happens at the server, and communication between client and server is done over SignalR. And that also has some pros and some cons. I'll touch that really quickly. Obviously, we are all about client-side Blazor. This is the Blazor application that runs in your browser. It does C# in your browser, and it brings all the good stuff that comes with the C# language, which is strongly typed, it's object-oriented,